Welcome back, everybody, to this second session this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Emmanuel KREIKE. Have I said that right? No, I knew it. Nobody does. Okay. Okay. All right. I thought it was going to be a pretty good guess, but I should have done. My KREIKE. KREIKE. Yes, yes. I'll do the second speaker much better. But Emmanuel is a fellow here at the institute this year. He's also a professor of war and society at Princeton University, and his training and his work explores the role of the environment in history, and especially in war. And from my point of view, it's hard to imagine a subject which is more important than that. He's written an extraordinary amount, but the work that has influenced me, well, because I read it, is his 2021 book, Scorched Earth, Environmental Warfare as a Crime Against Humanity and Nature, which revisited many of the wars that I thought I was familiar with, and it laid bare just how horrific they were, the environmental aspects of these wars and the deliberate environmental aspects of these wars. So it showed a horrible face that traditional war studies didn't, seems to hide for some reason somehow. It's really actually quite horrible stuff. He's a pleasant enough chap in person, which is why I'm glad he's here in person, and to share his perspective and his experience in years of environmental work and war. And it's over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll try to get right into it because there's a lot to say about the nature of war, more than 20-25 minutes will allow. But I can't help myself. So the nature of war, right? I noted, as you see on the outline, that actually what I noted is that Ellen always used small level, nature of war without capitals. And I was going to say originally, but I'm right. So what I'm going to contribute is a different viewpoint, nature with a capital, because I'm interested in the environmental context of war and war. So here, war as Environcide, and thinking about the title and coming up with a more specific focus on what Ellen was interested in exposing here today. I am playing today with this idea of denaturalizing modern counterinsurgency conflict. So it actually speaks to many of the ideas and comments that were made earlier on. And I won't go into that right now. So I will start with trying to stick to my text, but as time runs out, I will probably have to summarize some things. So I'm working on I'm trying to summarize in a pretty convoluted way, I realize, because it's more than a couple of lines, what I want to do and what are at stakes with my larger projects. So the larger project is a book, and today I will focus on specific aspects of it. So my argument is that international human rights law has failed to constrain modern conflict, and international humanitarianism and developmentalism has been ineffective in promoting post-conflict reconstruction in conflict regions, especially in the global south. Conflict in the global south and insurgency war in general is naturalized in terms of, it's being said it's war in, by, and against a state of nature. They're bush wars, basically, jungle wars. 20th century human rights law, humanitarianism, and developmentalism were deeply shaped, is my argument, by the nature-culture binary paradigm that locates the global south in a state of nature. And my aim with this project, which I've been able to work on for a year here with comments and suggestions by Ellen at the Institute, for which I'm very grateful, by highlighting a genealogy of post-World War II insurgencies and counterinsurgencies in the global South, I hope to demonstrate how these conflicts were and are naturalized, placing them beyond the pale of modern law, of morality, culture, politics, and economics, and indeed civilization and modernity as a whole. So I deploy the concept of Environcide. Oh, let me see. My next slide, really. Yes. Environmental warfare and Environcide to bridge this nature-culture dichotomy. Right, this dichotomy of war against nature on the one hand and war against culture, humanity on the other hand, right, with as its respective most extreme expressions, ecocide on one side and genocide on the other, right, and with using that concept of Environcide, I hope to bridge this binary and show that there actually war against nature and war against humanity, against culture, are actually two sides of the same coin. And just to give you an idea, I can't go into much detail here, of course. Environcide, what I mean with that is the targeting of what I call environmental infrastructure, rural infrastructure, not only rural infrastructure, but for the purpose of this talk, I will focus on rural environmental infrastructure. Infrastructure, homes, farms, fields, water sources, etc., that sustains the lives and livelihoods of human populations, right? And it highlights the urgent need to remedy the epistemological inheritance of a past paradigm, and I hope to identify and lay out a new conceptual pathway to remedy the shortcomings and craft a more efficient and also equitable system to prevent conflict, mitigate the levels of violence during conflict, and promote post-conflict material and immaterial reconstruction and restitution. So, okay, so that's laying out in a nutshell, a big nutshell, what the larger project is about. Now I'm going to try to sort of focus it a little bit more to fit it into the time frame I have. So, and another important point, and that's what I've focused on today, is that this naturalizing of modern insurgency and counterinsurgency conflict is not merely a given of the colonial or imperial origins or context. Right? It is in equal measures a product of the warfare experience itself during the conflict, which I will focus on actually a little bit more on today, as well as in terms of post-conflict history and memory making. And in the larger book project, I look at this series of wars, starting with the Indonesian Independence War and ending with the Southern African Liberation Wars. And today I will offer a sketch, preliminary sketch of, well, first I will lay out a little bit more sort of a general theoretical and historiographical context of this naturalizing and why and how this happened. And then I will give you short examples from my research on the French Indochina and Algerian wars during the counterinsurgency. So I will not go into memory after or the positions before, but I'll give you some examples to show how this naturalizing of wars was occurring during the two conflicts themselves. And of course, this is very preliminary, and this is based on research in the splendid archives. I mean, it's a sad, war is a bad thing, but the wonderful archives, they are at the French Ministry of Defense at Vincennes, where I spent a lot of time, and the French Colonial Archives in Aix-en-Provence. Okay, so environmental infrastructure. So belligerents persist in routinely treating the environmental infrastructure that populations depend on for their lives, livelihoods, and ways of life as an object and weapon of war. targeting civilian populations through scorched earth, starvation and environmental warfare, and population displacement triggers famines and epidemics, risking ecocide and genocide. But as, again, I can't go into much detail, but as you know, genocide and ecocide are both very problematic to prosecute. Right? Genocide has a very high level of evidence it requires. It requires proving intent, right? And it needs to be systematic. It's entirely separate, right? And so environmental destruction during war or destruction of environmental infrastructure, right, especially in the global south, is very difficult to use in genocide because it's indirect, right? I'm trying to summarize here because this is probably a little bit too detailed for the time frame I have. Why, you know, and we have this, so on the one hand you have genocide, which is very difficult to prove. It has to be direct, it has to be intentional, right? And that's of course very difficult to prove if you're, say, destroying huts or destroying food, because the aim is not necessarily to destroy the population. And that's what you see in military reports everywhere. They're not there to exterminate people. They're there to drive them out, to displace them, or to undermine rebel support, right? So that's a big challenge. On the other hand, you have ecocide, but ecocide is a sort of lower a lower level of crime, right? And also there has never been a successful prosecution for ecocide, environmental destruction during wartime, right? So both of these are very problematic. The main issue, although the main issue I would say is however, right, and this is sort of partly a response to my colleague in international law. She was making this distinction between, right, on the one hand, international human rights law in international wars context, and on the other hand, non-international ones within the context of a war, right? Within the context of a state. But there is another, maybe even, well, from my perspective, I would argue maybe even a another hindrance to prosecuting these crimes and to use ecocide and genocide and environmental humanitarian law and international environmental law to limit the impact of war, to regulate war, to mitigate war, and also to post-war, you know, pursue justice and recovery and restitution issues. And that is that our whole body of international law and also developmentalism and modernization, right? It's all these ideas, all these rules, right, that were laid out this morning, right? All these 1949 convention and all these rules, they were created in a context where, and from the base of a system of knowledge that was based on a binary nature culture. And that binary nature culture, right, this was very dominant until at least 2000, right? Now with environmental change, climate change, we are actually digging ourselves out of that paradigm. But of course, developmentalism, modernization, you know, international law, humanitarian law, these were all created in the context of that paradigm, and they reflect that paradigm. And that is why you have this sharp distinction between international human rights law, right, and with genocide at the apex. And on the other hand, you have international environmental law with at the apex genocide, right? The two can't meet. There is no in between. right? It's a binary, there are two extremes. And the context of why it is more pernicious in the global south is that the global south, especially the rural global south, is relegated into the category of nature. People live in and by nature, right? So this has many consequences for international law in terms of, and I'll just give one property, in terms of property, for instance, right? A hut built of natural materials. Is that culture or nature? Usually it's called nature. Property in the global south is usually seen as communal in nature, right? But communal property is not real property, say, under many statutes of law. And for instance, pillaging communal property, or pillaging property that's not seen as private, is not pillaging in the definitions we're using in international law. Okay, let me see where I can pick up. Where am I now? Okay. All right. So to come back to this, right? So this binary, and how this works out in many of our concepts in law, economics, etc., it's very clearly manifests itself in the theory and practice of war about and in the global south. Again, I'm not saying it's exclusive to it, right? Because we see that we see these issues coming up in the war in Ukraine. What is happening there? Is this genocide? Is this ecocide? Or is it something that actually merges these two? Which, of course, I would be tending to say. But this binary very clearly manifests itself. War in the global south is often described as primitive and barbaric, fought by undisciplined armed bands, right? Rather than armies and states that, like pre-modern armies, right, lack any logistical apparatus. So they live off the land, extorting, abusing civilians, ignoring and breaching the laws of war and human rights at will. And moreover, the war theaters themselves are often depicted as wilderness, jungle, or bush, that is primitive nature. So you see here a reflection also of I don't know your name, but you asked about terrorism, right? So how we now talk about terrorism, of course, 10, 20 years ago, that was this kind of war was described in those terms, right? Terrorists are seen as beyond civilization, beyond the concepts of law, and in these wars in the global south, this was the same. Actually, I might want to remind you that the Algerian rebels and the Viet Minh rebels in Indochina were also called terrorists at the time. Okay, so the objective of any counterinsurgency, right, is to cut off the insurgents from the rural population and its villages, homes, livestock, fields, pastures, etc. Its environmental infrastructure. Right. In turn, these insurgents struggle to maintain control over the countryside and its resources because they live off the land. Think of Mao's fish in the water. The guerrillas are like fish in the ocean, right? The ocean is the rural context. Now, and how jungle and wilderness war, right? If you think of it, most of the successful guerrilla movements are actually not in the jungle. They're not in the wilderness. Right? Because as Mao says, right, and highlights, these guerrilla movements live off the land. They use the local population to feed themselves, information, money, right, shelter, etc. Right? So, for instance, the fighting in Vietnam, as you know, was mostly not in the jungle. Right? One of the main fronts was the Mekong Delta, which was and still is one of the most heavily changed society environments in the world. Very heavy and very dense population. Same is true, right, in my research in Southern Africa. The South Africans talk about the Bush War, when they were resisting the guerrillas in Mozambique, in Namibia and South Africa. But actually one of the main fronts was the Angolan-Namibian boundary, which is also one of the most densely inhabited regions in Africa, and it was also before the war. Okay, let me get to, okay, so again, to summarize, the problems are this, and then I'll get to give you some examples from Indochina, the French Indochina War and Algerian War to illustrate, right? So the issue is, because of this nature-culture dichotomy, we're working with principles and ideas that relegate war, especially in the global south, and insurgency war, I think in general, into sort of a state of nature, right? It's jungle war, it's in the jungle, you fight with the jungle, against the jungle more than people. So it puts these wars beyond the scope and beyond the pale of civilization. And those people don't fight honest wars, don't stick to the rules. So we don't need to, right? It's like revolutionary wars. I'll have a quote for that. And also, of course, in terms of post-war recovery, so in terms of laws to prevent or mitigate war, it doesn't work because it's nature, right? It's not culture for which these rules are made. And the other context is, since it's taking place in nature and people live in nature, nature is self-healing, it's not property. So there's no need for, say, a martial aid in post-war Southern Africa, although it was, destroyed by 20, 30 years of war, which is again similar in its impact to World War II in Europe. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples then about, not so coordinated, I can only focus on one thing at the same time, which is, a weakness sometimes. So perhaps representative of the French view, right, during the Indochina War, that they were fighting a wilderness is a 1950 study by a French army engineer who complained that the dense jungle vegetation erased his roads, right, which is the main thing he was there, building roads. They were erased in less than 2 years because, the jungle just took over, right? And the deltas he was working in, right, were so soggy that his men had to go bare feet, right, and could not use their heavy equipment to fight. And this slide, I know it's a pretty bad copy, but the text under it, so this is from a French propaganda thing about the Air Force, and the Air Force being very important in the Indochina War. And it shows here the jungle, right? And then it says, forest, dark, mysterious, often impenetrable, ideal hiding place from the aviator's gaze and refuse. Oh, sorry. I was changing it last night after 12 o'clock and I forgot to correct it. But, so that's the jungle. But actually, right? See if I have, and here you have another one, right? This is the text in French under this photo, lost in nature, the towers stand guard. And you see here the problems. Well, the towers you can't see. They're watchtowers with a small post that the French instituted in Indochina to control the roads, prevent ambushes, right? You can't see them, right? Even in this photo. But you also see the issue with calling this nature, right? There's nothing natural about this landscape. This could be, Holland today, right? These are canals. This is the Mekong Delta. So there's I found this 1953 strategic assessment of the war, acknowledged that the locale, right, and the object of war were the villages, hamlets, farms, and fields. But at the same time, he naturalized this environment. He called it a living environment, right? So making it into nature rather than culture, right? Infrastructure and culture, right, is dead. It's the people who animate culture. But nature animates itself because it's living itself. And the people are sort of part of this and not separate from it. Okay. Now, interesting enough, the Viet Minh resisted this naturalizing very early in the war. So I found in the archives this, so the French, they rejected the name of Maquis, right? They used their equivalent was my Vietnamese not so good, so I apologize in advance. But maquis in Vietnamese is bung bien, right? And they sent an order, the high command sent an order to all its local commanders all across Vietnam in October 1948, so very early in the war, and said, you cannot, for the liberated zones, do not use maquis or bien ho as the French are doing. Because it says the French enemy uses the term to its advantage in its propaganda to pretend that they're always in control and that the resistance consists of a small group of people who play hide and seek in the maquis, rather than a general movement that affects the entire country and, later on it says, and is fought by a state with a real bureaucracy, right? Okay, so scorched earth and free fire zones. Here you see an example of that. I don't know if you can see it actually, but in the top corner, top left corner, there is a zone in, well, it's not in color, but this map, so I have to describe it to you. This map shows the boundaries of the French controlled areas, and much of it is beyond its boundaries, right? So the Viet Minh from the beginning targeted French plantations and called for a boycott of the colonial economy, right? The French in turn, right, tried to prevent the Viet Minh from living off the land, right? And this struggle very quickly evolved into an annual petty war, right? Early in December, January, February, March, when that's the season for the main harvest of the main paddy, right? And this became almost sort of a yearly sort of very, very violent ritual, with the Viet Minh trying to attack and disturb the harvest in the French-controlled areas. And the French, in turn, attacked the zones that were under control of the Viet Minh and destroyed all harvest and all habitations there. So the French did all the French large-scale operations into Viet Minh-controlled territory were in this period. It coincided with the harvest, the drying of the rice, and the storing of the rice. The French in 1950 instituted so-called war zones and unrestricted air intervention zones. These are four translations of the much more poetic French. In the war zones, anything was a legitimate target during operations, while in the latter, the unrestricted air intervention zones, anything was a legitimate target anytime. Right? So there was no distinction made between civilian or non-civilian. And actually, unlike what maybe my colleague was suggesting, it is an almost impossible distinction to make. And that's what you very clearly see on the ground in any war, I would say, any war I studied, at least, right? And this distinction between the two zones, you might say, oh, that's, they're sensible. But this distinction was not made for the Vietnamese. It was made to prevent friendly fire incidents, because the French once in a while bombed their own allies by accident because they were in one of these zones. So they said, no, we have to create two zones, one where we can operate, we coordinate, and the other one, the Air Force can attack any time they want. Okay, I have to be very quick. I first was not going to talk about use of napalm, because first I have a colleague who is interested in these kind of issues, especially in World War II incendiary firebombing on the cities. But I realized that I have to, because it became actually one of the most effective French weapons in this petty war, right? They could actually use, they found out they could use napalm very effective to attack crops, to attack villages, because it has a much wider, how do you call it? Its impact radius of napalm is much higher than most other bombs, especially when people start digging in with trenches and hiding things underground, which the Vietnamese very quickly did. Right, and also just to talk about this distinction. Oh, skipped something. So here we see a French plane bombing a village in Vietnam. Again, this distinction was very difficult to make. Okay, now I have to be quite quick, so I'm going to move a little bit through this. Now, a few preliminary kind of comments on based on the archives on the struggle in Algeria. So Algeria was the war there started immediately. Well, the fighting in Vietnam was actually not finished yet. A number of troops were brought straight from Indochina and put into action in Algeria, including many. Maybe you don't know this. I was amazed by this. I didn't know it. Many colonial troops, Moroccan troops, Algerian troops, Senegalese troops, Tunisian troops fought in Indochina and were then transferred to Algeria. Many of them actually joined the Maquis, right, which the French also used again in this, and both sides very heavily drew on experiences in Vietnam. Right, the FLN organized itself and targeted. It was almost a used carbon copy almost of how the Viet Minh operated in China, and the French army was very aware of it. And what they did also in return, they actually used many of the tactics and strategies, including the use of napalm and the use of these different zones. Right here you see one of the planes that was used for. It's very difficult to actually find out about this. It's not only napalm. I'm now focusing a little bit on napalm because I know it's a big debate in France, right? But it was not only napalm that did this. French did a lot of ground operations also to destroy these harvests, to destroy the circulation and preparation and hiding of grains. But right, napalm was certainly a very important weapon in this war to destroy these harvests. Right, but of course I don't know exactly why. You know, living in America and hearing about Vietnam every day, where napalm was used very extensively and openly. Right, everybody knows that picture of that girl who was actually affected by napalm. I'm not entirely sure why the French are so sensitive and were at the time of using. It's probably international attention, I think, or maybe international law, because in their reports they don't use napalm. I actually found one report that actually uses explicitly napalm, but throughout all the reports, even at the very low levels, they use bidons spéciaux. But it is very clear that it is napalm, and it's also very clear that it was used. The bidons spéciaux were used very extensively against all targets, especially in these different zones. Okay, what they also did, and this was unlike in Indochina, right? That's why I'm saying this sort of the genealogy of the nature of war. Unlike in Indochina, they used a very it was violent, of course, but it was still a very sophisticated, what later is called hearts and minds program. They hardly did anything like that in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it was very destructive, mainly. In Algeria, they actually tried to use a lot of propaganda. You saw the posters earlier. They used a lot of propaganda, but they also, the army actually got involved. They actually created a special service, the sort of SAS, Service d'Administration Spéciale. Probably not a coincidence that they were, the name is SAS, which is also the special forces of the British, who were famous for their counterinsurgency in Malaya and other places. It was probably play. The military couldn't let that go, I guess. But the military got very involved in forced removals, creation of villages. Actually, many, you've heard about the villagization in Vietnam and probably also about Algeria. Well, many people in Algeria were removed at least twice, right? Because there were two different villagization programs. There was an early one in the war, which is called the regroupement, and that started as a completely improvised thing, right, with tents. And in the beginning, it was pretty controlled, right? They put up schools, water, sometimes even electricity. They had army teachers, they built schools with army teachers, free medical service. But as they intensified the war, and during that war, pushed the FLN, right, which was originally actually very heavily based in the urban centers, into the rural areas, and subsequently into the remote forests and the remote mountains, right? So also naturalizing the war and actually turning it into a wilderness war, right? So as that happened, more and more refugees came to these French camps. So these camps were completely, they didn't have the resources or the skills, the military, to really take care of these massive amounts of refugees. Yet in a very kind of desperate move, right, later in the war, in 1950 and 51, they do the so-called représente, and they moved some of these people actually back to the areas where they came from, but in concentrated villages. So they still had to, and they also started rebuilding these villages. So you see an example here of, this is an example of one of these représentes. This is a représente that was completed, but also they got so many refugees and they moved so many people themselves that they were soon overwhelmed. And by 1953, right, it was clear that the war was winding down. So the funding for the military to do these projects and for the administration in Algeria started decreasing very rapidly. So all these programs kind of went basically to naught, and many of these représente and regroupement became actually, there was lots of complaints that they became actually, it's probably a little bit too far, but that there were concentration camps. But there was a lot of it. It's clear from medical reports that there was a massive malnutrition. There were smallpox, cholera outbreaks in these camps. And despite the French intentions and the enormous investments in 51 and 52 especially, in these camps and in creating infrastructure, schools, health clinics, etc., as soon as the ceasefire in 54 was signed, en masse the population abandoned these camps and went back to the ruins of their former homes. So I have no conclusion yet, except to use these cases to illustrate that during these wars, the war in many aspects, it was these insurgencies and counterinsurgency became naturalized, right? In terms of where the war started, who the war was against, right? Not really culture, but poor rural people, right? That had no sense, that only were interested in food and had no awareness of international politics or political organization or democracy, right? They were seen as part of a living organism, part of nature. Right? So there was, you could move them at will. They were sort of like, pawns that could be used in the name of development and modernization in the war. Right? And also, of course, the war moved increasingly. The rebels and their supporters, as the war intensified, they were pushed back gradually into the remote areas because that was the only places where they could survive. And at the same time, the places that had been places of habitation that were exposed to the French attacks, right? They were abandoned by the population and they were in effect rewilding. So you end up with this post-war situation where, much of the rural areas are destroyed and there's very little recognition that needs to be rebuilt in any of the wars that I'm looking at. Thank you.